What did the Sega Saturn, Sony Playstation, and Nintendo 64 have in common? They ran Quake. Console ports of Quake have generally been way less hit and miss than console ports of Doom, and yet far fewer people talk about them. The Saturn and N64 could both run Quake 1, while the PlayStation and N64 could both run Quake 2. Unlike with the console versions of Doom, there's no bad version of Quake or Quake 2, so let us check out the differences between the versions. Starting with Quake 1. The N64 version of Quake was released in March of 1998 by Midway. An immediate difference between this and all other versions of Quake is the lack of an introductory level. Instead, Quake 64 decides to just show you a simple main menu. There exists a 2-player split-screen mode, but the performance in it is pretty awful. The Saturn version of Quake was actually the first officially released port of Quake. It was released in November of 1997 by Lobotomy Software, and spat in the face of anyone who claimed the Saturn was a 2D-only console. This is a far more faithful port than the N64 version, even though it lacks all the multiplayer modes. Several levels are not present in these versions. In the N64 version, you progress through levels linearly without the ability to choose what episode you play. The N64 version is missing E1M4, E2M1, E2M4, E3M5, E4M1, and E4M5. The Saturn version lacks the vanilla Quake E1M8, E2M7, E3M7, and E4M7 hidden levels, replacing them with 4 new levels exclusive to the Saturn version. The N64 levels are way less detailed than their Saturn counterparts. They lack decorative geometry in many places and have way worse looking textures. The textures themselves also tend to loop in a very noticeable and ugly way. However, these downgrades ensure that the game runs at a mostly rock-solid frame rate, even during action. On the Saturn version, basically every single 3D model was redone because the Saturn uses quads instead of triangles. The game is basically the opposite of the N64 version. The frame rate is a bit more choppy, but it's never unplayable, and more importantly, it looks pretty good. Minus the warping you might sometimes see on the edge of the screen, but it's not very noticeable, especially when you're focusing on killing the thing in front of you. Water is a funny one, because the N64 has this cool wavy effect, while the Saturn has moving shadows on the surface under the water, though without the wavy effect. The water itself, in my opinion, is way better looking in the Saturn version and way more animated as well. Lighting is also another very interesting topic, and we'll also talk about the moodiness here. The Saturn version has a ton of dynamic lighting, like when you toss grenades and such. The N64 version lacks this. The Saturn version also has very subdued, though still colorful lighting, while the N64 version is a bit brighter and uses way more colored, though static lights. Sound is an interesting but really simple topic. The N64 version has different ambient music, while the Saturn version keeps the original soundtrack. Otherwise, the sound is about what you would expect for a cartridge versus disc-based game. The Saturn version has high fidelity audio, as there's far more space for it on the disc. The N64 has better controls, but only just. You can reconfigure the N64 version's controls so you can play with a pseudo-dual analog scheme using the D-pad and joystick. The Saturn version supports a similar control scheme using the face buttons and the control stick, though it's forced inverted with look spring, and you can only use it if you input a specific cheat code, otherwise you're stuck with tank controls. But it's not that bad. You can reconfigure most of the controls to your liking. The analog shoulders let you strafe a little or a lot depending on how long you press on them, and I personally set up my controls with A, shooting, B, looking, which basically means that tilting the stick up and down makes me look up and down and not walk forwards and backwards, Y jumps, while C and Z swap weapons. It's a bit to get used to for sure, but it's still a very usable control scheme. Can you believe that the N64 version has worse loading times? Seriously, I tested it, and it's about 7 seconds versus 8.5. You see, while the Saturn version just loads the level files from disk, the N64 version has to decompress them, because cartridge space is a rare commodity. Thanks to this, N64 owners got to experience the drawback of the cartridge format with none of the benefits. This version of the game also cost £60 UK according to the N64 Magazine UK, which it only managed to do by using a 12MB cartridge, which is why it has to compress levels. Overall, I found the Saturn version a little bit more challenging to get used to due to the control scheme, but both games offer a very similar level of challenge, with the levels being mostly the same. I believe that the Saturn version is the superior Quake console port. The N64's controls are superior and the rock-solid frame rate is a good bargaining chip, but the superior graphics, sound, loading, and more faithful level design just make the Saturn version, in my opinion, better. So that's Quake. But you know what they say, if Quake is so good, where's Quake 2? And in 1997, Quake 2 released. Of course, it would take us until 1999 to see Quake 2 on consoles, but it was worth it. The N64 version of Quake 2 was released by Midway in July of 1999. This game immediately looks and plays a lot better than the last one. The PS1 version of Quake 2 was released by Hammerhead and somehow crammed most of Quake 2 onto a PS1. Both of these games are downgrades from the PC version. The N64 features 19 levels, while the PS1 version features 20. Both games have the same unique starting level, but while the PS1 version features mostly modified versions from the more notable PC levels, the N64 version features a far larger amount of new levels, though both have way less than the PC version. Also, while the N64 has 10 multiplayer levels, the PS1 version has 12, and both sets of levels are different, and both support up to 4 players plus screen multiplayer. Enemy-wise, both games lack the Barracuda Shark, Brains, and Technician, but while the PS1 version lacks the Mutant and Tank Commander, the N64 version lacks the Medic, Jorg, and Macron, though the PS1 version also has 2 new enemies, those being the Arachnid and Guardian. The N64 version runs relatively smoothly, but this time with some slowdown. While the textures are noticeably better compared to the last game, by like a lot, they're still not that great. The PS1 version has simplified geometry in several areas in order to preserve performance, though it still slows down a lot, even if it's never to unplayable levels. Compared to the N64 version, this one is sharp. The lighting has also been tuned up, and it's overall a lot more colorful and vibrant. The water looks better as well. Thanks to a subdivision algorithm, the PS1 version features almost no visible texture warping, and it also features a high horizontal resolution. You see, while the N64 version runs at 320x240, the PS1 version runs at 512x240, giving you a higher resolution. Overall, while the N64 version is closer to its PC counterpart, that one being GL Quake 2, visually, the PS1 version has its own unique aesthetic with far sharper visuals. While the PS1 version's levels are also simplified from the PC version, they still look great and have a pretty decent amount of detail still left in them, just not as much as the PC version. Transitional cutscenes and FMVs are another interesting difference between the two versions. While the N64 just has a map you traverse between each level, the PS1 version groups the levels into missions and shows you actual cutscenes between them. The N64 version has obviously more compressed sounds and great atmospheric tunes, but the main upside of the PS1 version's sound just has to be the music. Yes, it has the original PC version's tunes and also high-quality sound effects. Controls are an interesting one. You see, the controls of the N64 version are basically the same as the last one, just a little bit improved. The completely adequate serviceable D-pad and joystick system. But while the PS1's controller does support dual analog and you can use it, it also supports something much cooler. Mouse aim, baby. That's right. If you hold your controller with your left hand and use a mouse with your right hand, you can basically do keyboard and mouse. Left click shoots, right click jumps. It allows for far better precision and honestly makes the game kind of easy. If you're curious about the loading speeds, they're still kind of awful on the N64, though they're faster than Quake 1, and actually faster than the PS1 version this time, with around 7 versus 8.5 seconds, basically an inverse of the last one. Obviously, this still uses the same 12MB cartridge, and it's a part of a reason why it only has 19 levels, and completely unique ones it was to save in cartridge space. Even so, both games are a joy to play, though the biggest draw and benefit of the PS1 version is the way it loads levels. So it has two types of loading zones, long and short ones. Short ones are about 4 seconds long and have this little loading thingy, while the long ones last about 8 seconds and have the spinning thing in the corner. While you're in a mission, you can backtrack to previous levels if you want to, and you can save your progress while doing so. This is where you get the longer loading zone. The shorter ones are just inside the existing levels, and while they can be a little bit annoying sometimes, you can basically tell when they're coming up, and they're not too bad. Honestly, they could have avoided this by having a level loading system similar to Metroid Prime, where it basically locks you in a room and loads stuff in the background where it doesn't really seem like it's loading stuff, but the devs just decided not to bother, and it's not that big of an issue. This one is really close. Overall, the levels are quite different from each other, so both games are worth a try to experience both sides of the story. However, between the two, the PS1 version has a bit more content, better controls, sharper visuals, and more interesting level progression, alongside the better sound and music, while the N64 version runs better and tends to have the more complex level geometry, though it's never too far from the PS1 version in terms of detail. Combine that with the better and more interesting cutscenes of the PS1 version, and I'd argue that the PS1 version is better, but barely. Both are definitely worth a shot. So there you have it, Quake 1 and 2 console ports. The N64 versions of these games are still very good, though all 4 of these ports are still somewhat inferior to their PC counterparts. But remember, the Saturn, PS1, and N64 combined all cost less than a PC that could get a semi-playable frame rate in Quake 1. If you check the minimum requirements, just the CPU, a 75MHz Pentium, costs around $275 at the time, and it had worse performance than the Saturn version by quite a bit. Now Quake 2? Well, that required an even faster PC, and just for the minimum requirements. That's what makes these ports special. They still managed to be solid versions of their PC counterparts, and the system they came on didn't cost an arm and a leg. Overall, I recommend all 4 of them, but I have my personal preferences, even if, honestly, you can go both ways with Quake 2 and with Quake 1. I mean, it is just, do you get used to the weird controls for the better version, or, you know. But overall, that's gonna be about it. I'll see you next time. I don't know what I'll do. Play Mega Man Legends 2. Bye-bye.